interesting points that I'm worried that people can't hear. Why don't you say that?
Briefly, that social scientists have, not just psychologists, we begin with words. Philosophers begin with words. Biologists don't begin with words. We should begin with phenomena. So let's take a trait that is called temperamental. Infants vary in how irritable they are. And the mother's report correlates modestly with behavior. Okay, some infants are irritable and some are. So we have some. That's the way a biologist would operate. Okay, and we'll explore that. It turns out some babies are irritable because their mothers were very stressed or were ill during their pregnancy. Oh, we got one orange. Others happen to inherit a certain set of genes for the serotonin transporter and DRD4 receptor. And their mothers weren't stressful. Now we got another cause of it. And in others, these babies had an infection, or they were premature. So now we have all the types, that is the origins of this behavior. Because there is no behavior we study that has one cause. None. And now we'll follow them. And then we'll take another behavior. Some babies smile and laugh a lot. We'll do the same thing. And in 30 years, when all these data are in, and we see what's going on, then you can decide which one should we call temperament. It's totally irrelevant. I mean, to agree on a definition of temperament when we don't know anything doesn't make any sense at all. And no biologist would begin that way.
Okay, so who would like to respond to that question?
Question number 2.
I would be glad to break out on my moderator role for a minute to try to answer. Having just studied for my son's Regents biology test with him the other day on classification, I would say biologists, if we're thinking about classifying and sort of sorting out things, right? So if we're thinking about taxonomies, right? Biologists would start with a lot of phenomena because the only way that they can sort them is by how does this one relate to this one, relate to this one. So I would say you do not want to start with, I have sympathy to what you're saying, but you would not want to start just with irritable infants, right? You'd want to be looking at a whole bunch of different individual differences in kids and seeing how those things relate to each other, right?
If you have the funds and staff,
yeah. But what I'm saying is it's going to be very, and I have great sympathy with what you're saying because I never liked definitions of temperament personally because I think we're just saying, yes, this is how I prefer to see things. But I would say to actually come up with a sort of a taxonomy, it's better to study a whole lot of things at once, right? To figure out how they relate to each other.
yes, I do, but that, we're talking about a couple of million.
Right.
And the average investigator, not just in this room, doesn't have access to the future.
Yeah, maybe so. All right, go ahead, Marcel.
But, I think that, isn't it true that when you started doing research on temperament, implicitly, you have some of these criteria in mind. You're looking for something that is related to biology. You're looking to something that is enduring over time. You're looking for something maybe that is already in animals. In fact, some of your first articles mentioned the individual differences in inhibition in animals. So implicitly, I think that these criteria are with us and with you as well. We need something that guides our...
Marcel, you know as well as I do, I didn't start out, I'm going to be a temperament researcher. I started out because we saw IMO reactive infants. That's what we started out with. Said, gee, they look very different. And then we followed. And then we learned a lot of things.
Okay. But it's a constellation. What I mean is the constellation of these criteria denotes a specific class of phenomena that we can call temperament or temperament, or it doesn't really matter. It's a constellation of criteria that define a certain class of phenomena.
Well, okay, so let me go ahead.
I was going to say that I understand your point, and far be it for me to argue Terry but I think that we have to, if we're all doing research in the area of temperament, we have to all agree that we're talking about the same thing.
We're talking about irritable infants or non-irritable infants. Whether it's temperament or not, it doesn't help us. doesn't help us. Let's take glorified surgeons, let's study surgeons. I mean, to argue whether it's temperament or not temperament, that's irrelevant if we don't know the cause. Temperament implies, what's it, I mean, words change their meaning, but in the original meaning that Hippocrates and Galen thought, they were thinking of human. They thought of origins. And so, then we can argue about the origins. So you might find some infants with high surgency where the origin has no biology whatsoever. And then if you want to say, well, that's not a temperamental surgency, okay. But the words they don't explain anything.
Let's hold that thought. Really, what did you
I
want to
think
answer
that
before?
communicates something. I really do agree with this idea that for us to all organize ourselves, for us to communicate, what I think we all share in terms of belief regarding the natural way of things to other people, it is valuable to have a common, agreed upon set of criteria for a wide variety of phenomena. And not,
I agree, but we can say, let's start with variation that appears early in life and seems to have a biological component, doesn't have to be inherited. That, and then to add that it's temperament doesn't add anything. It just says that does limit it. And I'm not studying 10-year-olds who are doing anything actually do it. I think that's what Marcel was trying to get at.
Yeah.
It's early. We think it has some biological contribution rather than purely experiential. Well, that does limit a lot.
But it's hard to fit all that on a program and
All right, well, let me ask, before I want to move on to the next question, but I also feel like it's important to see if we have other, yeah, I'd like to hear at least one other question. Roy went first, and I'll get back to them.
I just want to caution us about the distinction between whether it's conscious or not, because learning in its beginning stages is conscious, but after you've learned it, it's not. It becomes an automatized system. So I don't think that's going to help us, like Sam, get us down the line. And this troubles me because when we get to things like effortful control, that word always connotes to me a conscious process. And I had a big argument one time with Mary.
Me too.
About this word, and I said,
Yeah.
Mary, that tells me, you're telling me that it's conscious. And she says, oh no, it's sometimes conscious, sometimes not. And I understand that it could be, but I'm still, if we're going to divide this world of temperament up, I'm still hung up whether effortful control fits nicely into a model. I'm not sure that it fits nicely. It may be a learned and then unconscious process that starts to mediate things that happen most often.
Okay, all right, so that's a point, right, more than a question.
I'm sorry.
No, it's a good, points are good. We're in favor of points. You want to respond to that?
No, I think I chose the wrong word, and I think that there are conscious things that maybe can be considered temperament. I guess it's really more cognitive aspects, and then once we get into that, then we have to start talking about the definition of cognition. And I think you've got a point well made.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
I'd like to suggest that item 6 be expanded somewhat. Personality researchers make much of the impact of temperament on personality traits and adjustment, but there are a number of other things besides school function and coping skills and so on. How about the impact on a variety of physiological functions, on eating disorders, on sleeping problems, on elimination disorders? Here is a huge area where temperament matters, and very few people are paying attention to that. So I would like to see your number 6 expanded to include impact on physiological function. For an overall definition, I have found very useful that it's temperament is behavioral style, it's the way the individual experiences and reacts to the environment. That doesn't say it's all genes, it doesn't say it's all anything. It just is an overall description of what I think we mean by temperament.
Okay. Anyone want to respond to that? I think that was implicit. I think what you're saying was implicit in Marcel's final criteria, right?
It was just an example.
Yeah, those are just examples.
It's just an example.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be, the list could be, infinitely amplified.
Right.
But since my complaint as a clinician is that it isn't. There is not much clinical research by academicians, and I think a real opportunity for major contributions is being lost.
Okay, so let's go to the second question, which is really very much related to the first. It has to do with the elements of temperament. Really, I mean, it's a hard question to answer without having some answer to the first. But, okay, so the question is, what are the elements of temperament? Elements refers here to the basic units or trait dimensions. Do the basic dimensions remain the same? And to answer this question, you have to think about where do we come up with this idea of what the basic units are. So, okay, Sam agreed to go first.
So I would say that my thinking about the basic elements has really risen out of factor analysis. And I'm aware of the problems with factor analysis, but because the results have been so consistent, and we can see so much covariation among patterns of behavior and patterns of traits, it's convincing to me, or compelling to me. So I'd say one basic element is, and also the fact that it's supported by models of motivation with animals, a behavioral approach system, a reward system that we call surgency in Mary's word, and that we see in other areas too, extroversion in the personality literature, a negative affect or a withdrawal system or an inhibition system, and there's not perfect overlap between a negative affect system and an inhibition system, but we'll leave that alone for now. And then I'd say the third would be the central control system.
Okay,
Or
okay,
attention
you wanna-
system.
yeah.
I don't think we need to elaborate.
Okay, all right. Fellow panelists, would you like to amend that list, or?
I don't have anything to add to the list. I just have sort of a behavioral genetics perspective might add something to it.
Yeah.
In that one of the things that people are talking about in clinical psychology is that we might be able to classify disorders in terms of their genes. So different genetic mechanisms are operating on different disorders. So for example, ADHD, you may be able to classify subtypes on the basis of different genes, specific genes, when you get to that point. And so I thought, perhaps we might be able to do that at some point, not now, obviously, but we might want to think about that and say, would we expect traits that are structurally related in terms of factor analysis, would we expect them to have a common etiology?
And I really would, and I think neurologically and at the molecular level we would. The dopamine regulating genes, we would imagine, would be really related to those reward systems. Mary, we talked about she talked about the anterior cingulate and frontal areas as being important for attentional ability. And I would say, I don't know exactly what genes are associated with that, but I do believe that the same genes that contribute to a tendency for high intensity pleasure are going to contribute to a high activity level, are going to contribute to real positive anticipation. So I think, not perfectly, I think there are distinctions, and I believe in looking at the fine grain components, but I believe that that maybe those fine grain components represent layers of other functions on top of the common functions of the United States.
So let me ask a follow-up question. So you're mentioning the diagnostic work, right? And the hope of being able to perhaps move it to more of a biological level, right? So I know for the last, you all probably know that the DSM-5 is in the process of being completed, and the hope was for it. Part of why it got delayed so long is because they were hoping that they could have a taxonomy that was based entirely, or more so on sort of biological features, rather than on these descriptive features, which is how it's structured now. And then they came to the realization that that was completely implausible, that they were going to be able to have it be based on a biological taxonomy. So they said, all right, we finally have to go ahead and do the revision. So I guess my question for you is, when you're suggesting that